Part 3. The sound of clashing metal rang forth. Yeah. An unbelievable sight unfolded before Shaltier's eyes. The edge of the blade cleaved into Shaltier's chest from her shoulder, until it reached her unbeating heart. Shaltier's crimson armor was dyed an even deeper shade of red. She scrambled back, looking at Ains in shock. Ains held a katana. It was a massive nodachi, wreathed in electrical discharges. That sword had cut through Shaltier's armor as though slicing through paper. Her armor was a legendary class item. Only a rare few divine class weapons could go through it with such ease. Then there was only one answer. Yes. Ains was holding one of those few weapons. Shaltier screamed the name of that blade as she coughed up blood. Takumi Kazuchi Mk8. Shaltier leaped back, avoiding the strike from the nodachi. The fact that she had jumped so far beyond the nodachi's striking range was a sign of how frightened she was of that sword. However, nobody would mock Shaltier for doing, even less so if they were denizens of the great underground tomb of Nazarick. Rather, they would have sympathetic looks on their faces, because they all feared this weapon of the Supreme Being. They feared the sight of this sword, named after and wielded by warrior Takumi Kazuchi, one of the 41 Supreme Beings. Did I not say so, Shaltier? Ains Ulgan is invincible. Ains stepped forward, and Shaltier immediately took 2 steps back. Shaltier, you should know this. Ains Ulgan is the combined power of 41 people. You had no hope of victory from the start. Ains calmly said. His words rang with absolute confidence and the utmost assurance. The dangerous battle of earlier had been like treading on thin ice, where one false step might send him to the bottom of the lake. But now, Ains had brought the battle to his enemy. Currently, their MP was 0, but Shaltier's HP was higher. However, after using Perfect Warrior to become a level 100 warrior, Ains's stats far outstripped Shaltier, who was not a pure warrior. In addition, Ains's equipment was superior to hers. That meant the unfavorable battle from earlier was a thing of the past. The man who had turned the tables advanced with even, steady steps. Shaltier Bloodvatlen. Open your eyes and witness the might of the ruler of the great underground tomb of Nazarick, the one who gathered the supreme beings, and the man whom you praise with your very own mouth. Those words were the signal for the attack. Ains stepped forward and delivered an overhand strike with the nodachi. Shaltier leapt away, preparing to jump forward as she did. Her aim was to counterattack Ains in the opening after he made his move. Sure enough, it was hard to be overly precise with the nodachi Takumi Kazuchi Type 8, much like it was with the Spewet Lance. The lightning-swathed Takumi Kazuchi Mk8 rent the air as it swung down, and then the tip of the blade halted in front of Shaltier, who was preparing to jump, before thrusting forward at incredible speeds. No matter how strong one was, it was very difficult to stop a full-strength blow in the middle of a swing. This was especially true when one used a large and heavy weapon. Yet, Ains could do it. This was because he had not used all his force to attack. In other words, he knew that the strike would have been avoided, so he had deliberately feinted an opening. The continuation of that attack had also been planned out, down to which strike he would use to follow up. It was an instinctive, natural movement for a warrior. Ains simply provided the bodily strength to turn it into reality. However, he probably would not have considered these matters had he not experienced combat in Erantal. He would probably have unleashed one massive earth-shattering strike after the other, and taken Shaltier's counterattacks. Even after becoming a level 100 warrior, he would not have been able to fully utilize a warrior's abilities, and they would have ended up wasted. Much like driving a car, one might have a license, but there was a world of difference between someone who only had a license on paper and one who was used to driving on the open roads. Both of them could operate a car, but their reactions to sudden changes in circumstances would be drastically different. In other words, experience. During this battle with Shaltir, Ains felt that this experience was his most potent weapon. It'll be hard to avoid it. That was what Shaltir calmly thought as she saw the tip of the sword coming at her, as fast as lightning. However, thrusts were a risky move. One could use the weaknesses of thrusting attacks to turn a dangerous situation into an opportunity. Then, it can't be helped. Shaltir put her hand into the path of the thrust, having decided to sacrifice her left arm. As the blade pierced her palm, Shaltir twisted her left hand, successfully diverting the thrust to one side. It did not penetrate her chest, but the tip of the sword still drove through her left palm, into the muscle and bone, until it was deeply buried in her left arm. In addition, the electricity surrounding the Nodachi coursed through Shaltir's body. Though she was undead, the sensation of being savagely penetrated still filled Shaltir with something resembling terror, though she kept the corners of her mouth raised. It was a smile, not one which an injured person would make, but neither was it a brave front. After all, that was what Shaltir had intended. Shaltir tensed her left arm. The Nodachi halted, pinned down by her muscles. Thrusts were maneuvers that might end up leaving one's weapon stuck in a foe's flesh should they miss their mark. Hence, they were not very practical in combat. In other words, they had a weakness. Shaltir knew that weakness, which was why she had sacrificed her left arm to force an opening in her opponent's defense. She could not have done so if she could not grasp the Nodachi in her left hand in the instant before it impaled her, a feat which she had to perform within tenths of a second. "You're open now." Now that his Nodachi was tied up, Ains had no way of defending against the Spewit Lance. As Shaltir thrust the Spewit Lance at lightning speed, she once more beheld a startling sight. Ains let go of the divine-class weapon in his hand, a magic item of the highest order, and then withdrew one of the several wooden sticks slotted at his waist. "Ha! Are you retarded? How could a little stick like that block the Spewit Lance? And then you actually let go of your divine-class weapon. Isn't that a colossal mistake?" Granted, not remarrying attached to warrior Takumi Kazuchi's divine-class weapon was a wise decision, but there was no way he could win after losing that weapon. With a mocking smile on her face, Shaltir vowed to make Ains suffer more than her left hand had. She thrust the Spewit Lance with all her might, and then it was deflected, with a clear, crisp sound of metal against metal. Shaltir exclaimed in surprise. The wooden stick was no longer in Ains's hand, and in its place were two Kodachis, which had deflected the Spewit Lance. One was as blindingly brilliant as the sun, while the other glowed with the pure, gentle light of the moon. Ains's hand, which were holding the Kodachis, began smoking. It would seem that those weapons were the bane of the undead. "You were saying something about being open, Shaltir. Che. What's going on?" Shaltir could not feel the weight of the weapon which had pierced her left arm. It had vanished, as though it could not exist in the same world as the new weapons which Ains had prepared. Shaltir sensed that they had returned to their original place. "Well, that's true. If you can't handle a weapon in each hand, sticking to one would be wiser." Ains's mumblings seemed to have been directed at someone elsewhere. "Then, is that the case for me now?" Shaltir could not understand what he meant by those words, and after losing her balance, the moonlit Kodachi swung at her. The attack at her neck was a feint. The Kodachi nimbly altered its course and streaked at her shoulder. It was only by the barest of margins that the Spewit Lance managed to deflect it. Ains took the opportunity to close the gap with Shaltir. Since his foe was using a massive weapon, drawing nearer would make it harder for his opponent to make her move. This was the thinking of a grizzled veteran, one who was intimately familiar with that idea. Then, the other Kodachi, the sunlit one, sliced into the gap in the Spewit Lance's defense and lightly pierced Shaltier's body. Ah! She wailed in pain. Actually, being stabbed did not hurt that much. The problem was the agony which came from the holy element energy which filled her body like poison. That pain was much harder to bear. Ains worked the Kodachi from side to side while it was still within her, as though to saw open the wound. Get away from me. The distance between Shaltier and Ains was too narrow to use the Spewit Lance, so she kicked at him. He blocked it with the Kodachi, but he could not fully resist the kick and was flung back. At this moment, Shaltier saw that Ains's hands had released the Kodachis, and they had another small stick in them. Then, as the stick fragmented, a huge, savage-looking gauntlet covered Ains's hand. That gauntlet was so big that it nearly dragged on the ground from a standing position. "Take this!" And as Ains shouted, he punched her. Shaltier reflexively raised the Spewit Lance to defend herself, but the massive impact traveled through the Spewit Lance and washed over her entire body. "Gugya!" Shaltier yelped pathetically as she was flung backward, as though struck by a gigantic fist. The hit did not do much damage, and the Spewit Lance could block physical attacks, but the knockback effect was enough to overcome the magic items protecting her. She recovered her lost balance quickly thanks to her magic items, but a fire still burned inside her head. How dare you force such a pitiful sound out of me? I'll make sure you squeal like that before I tear you apart." Huh? Her eyes shifted, and as she saw a massive globe of light, Shaltier's agitation vanished. That flare of sunlight came from the bow Ains had drawn. Its arrow of light were naturally targeted at Shaltier. No way, how could that be? Hao Yi's bow. This weapon had been named after the hero who had shot down the sun while China was still a balkanized mass of smaller countries. It was also the main weapon of the supreme being who had created Shaltier. All the Guardians were protected against ranged weapons, so they did not have to worry about simple projectiles. However, those arrows of light did not do physical damage, but elemental damage. In other words, they were counted as magic attacks, and those defenses did not apply. Damn it. I'm out of MP. If I had some, I could defend myself with a spell. I'm out of skills too. If I had known, I should have saved a few uses for. No. The fact that she had used up all her MP and her skill uses were all the result of their previous battle. In other words, she had followed Ain Zulgaon's script to the letter. Shaltier's eyes turned bloodshot and she bellowed. This was the expression of one who had realized their mistake after the fact, and who was determined not to admit defeat. Damn you. How did you obtain Peronchino-sama's weapon? Was all this part of your plan? How did you prepare all these weapons? Where did you hide them? Was it a skill that activated after you broke those sticks? What on earth was going on here? It was as though the world itself was bending over backwards to help him out. What sort of magician would I be if I told you the secret of my tricks? A trick. A trick couldn't have summoned Peronchino-sama's weapon. Well, that's correct. Saying so is kind of disrespectful towards him. Simply put, I was using cash items. You should understand now, right? Everything you have done until now has been dancing in the palm of my hand. A fully charged orb of light streaked out at Shaltier. She knew it was useless, but she tried to block it with the Spewit Lance anyway, and then her surroundings were enveloped by a blast of exploding brilliance. Shaltier tried to think as the sacred radiance scorched her entire body. Retreating was pointless, and if this went on, there was nothing she could do but let him slaughter her at his leisure. That white armor had high defensive power, but he could not possibly be unscathed by a hit from the Spirit Lance. All she could do was count on her weapon's life-absorbing properties as she abandoned all defense and focused on an all-out attack. "You!" Shaltia gave voice to a battle cry that did not suit her face. A cold, clear voice responded to her. "The odds of victory are 7-3. I trust I need not say who is who." Ains slowly raised an axe made of red crystal that shed a purple glow. It was a menacing-looking great axe. As she saw this, Shaltia hesitated on whether or not to advance, but in the end she took a step forward. After all, there was nowhere for her to run. Such admirable determination. "This is the endgame, Shaltia. Ains Sama will win." Those words slipped out from Cositus as he shook his head. However, Demiurge, who lacked a warrior's knowledge, asked a question. Naturally, Demiurge was firmly convinced that his master would win. However, he needed to know more about the situation to make a logical analysis, and so he voiced the doubt in his heart. "Why is that? Should it not take a long time to determine victory?" Shaltia has abandoned defense for an all-out attack, would have done so in the same situation. Indeed, Ains Sama changed his weapons one after the other. In other words, she has no idea what other weapons Ains Sama possesses. Under these circumstances where she lacks further knowledge, Shaltia would conclude that running away is a foolish option after seeing Ains Sama's bow. Thus, all she can do is close the distance to the attack range of her Spirit Lance and fight. The fact that she can no longer use skills and magic only adds to that. At least, that is what I think. "I see. So that's how it was. After all, only you could fully grasp the weapons which the Supreme Beings did not show to us, Cositus." Cositus shrugged. "Only know of their effects and names, but have not seen them before." "I see. I think I understand, though I am unclear on the details." In other words, now that Shaltia is committed to an attack, Ains Sama has brought out the axe. Blood-drinking flesh-eater. "Thank you, Cositus. That blood-drinking flesh-eater does not look very balanced and seems inaccurate. However, it should be able to strike Shaltia, who has abandoned her defense." Mentioned it before, but the entire fight has gone as Ains Sama planned. Am in awe of his prowess. Ains Sama probably foresaw those developments. His insight is astounding, as expected of the one who gathered all the Supreme Beings. In all honesty, he could probably rule Nazarick easily without us. I am somewhat dissatisfied. His extraordinary ability as magic caster, no, as combatant, is truly an inspiration. Still, the battle is not decided yet, no. Ains Sama is still at a disadvantage compared to Shaltia in terms of health. Albedo simply smiled, because she was certain of Ains's victory. There will be no problem on that account. Why is that? That man is Ains Ulgaun, our ruler and supreme leader. Since he has declared he will seize victory, there is no doubt that he will attain it. Every attack ate away at their health. Shaltia's attacks restored her health, but the damage Ains dealt with every hit was enough to negate the health that Shaltia regained. The Spirit Lance chipped away at Ains's health, turning this into something like a game of chicken. Every time that axe scored a hit on Shaltia, it felt as though it would chop her armor to bits. She felt bones breaking and flesh ripping throughout her body. However, whenever she thrust her lance, which dealt bludgeoning damage thanks to a skill, she could feel bone fragmenting under her assaults. This feeling, "Can I win with this amount of health?" Joy filled Shaltier's heart, as she felt that there was still a chance of victory. If they continue trading blows, that might just be the case. After abandoning all thoughts of defense, Shaltier had thrown herself wholeheartedly into the attack, thinking only of seeing which of them would fall first. Shaltier, so full of anxiety, finally smiled as a light appeared in the darkness. This was because she had been calculating the rate of her health's depletion. The more she worried, the greater her joy would be. Aha! Shaltier laughed as she struck and was struck in turn. Aha! Ains-sama, it seems you'll run out of health first. The difference in our health will be what determines victory and defeat. And then, something dumped cold water on Shaltier's pride. It was a simple sentence. "Do you really think so?" Shaltier realized her foolishness as she heard the voice of the schemer who had run her ragged and who had controlled the progress of all the events which had unfolded thus far. Impossible. How did he intend to turn this situation around? Shaltier did not know how he would do it, but a third person's voice clarified her doubts. "Time's up, Manga-Anai-chan." It was a girl's voice. She had never heard this voice before, which seemed to be that of a woman pretending to be a child. It reminded Shaltier of a female voice she had heard before. If that woman had pitched her voice differently, it would probably have sounded like this. "Now, what do you think 'time's up' refers to?" Engrossed in trading blows and mauling her foe with her weapon, Shaltier had no idea what that question meant. A look of bafflement appeared on her pretty face. "If everything thus far has gone as I have planned, that means, the time which has passed has also been within my calculations. Now, what do you think that watch meant when it told us that time was up?" The axe in Ains's hands vanished, becoming a pure white shield. With his matching white shield and armor, Ains resembled a paladin of pure white. The shield rang crisply as it deflected the spew-at-lance's attack. Things being as they were, Ains had probably turned to defense because of that female voice, but Shaltier had no idea of the reason for that. As he went on the defensive, Ains's voice reached her ears amidst the clashing of metal. "Do I even need to say it? The battle is over, and victory has been decided." "Why?" Shaltier was still at 25% health. "How has victory been decided?" Shaltier wanted to scream, but she could not. "Super tier magic cannot kill you in one hit when you're at full health. Then, all I need to do is reduce your health until it can do so. And it would seem our back and forth just now has heavily depleted your health." Shaltier desperately attacked, trying to shut her opponent up and block out the knowledge of her impending defeat. The clashes of metal against metal rang out continuously, the interval between them less than a tenth of a second. Shaltier's continuous attack slashed at Ains like a storm. However, Ains neatly blocked them, with unimaginable speed. So skillful was he that it seemed that he could stand beneath a great waterfall and not get wet. As he effortlessly blocked the attacks against him, he continued, "It's true that I am inferior in terms of pure fighting ability. But my magical defense is superior. Then you should understand what I'm getting at, right? I'm about to make my move, Shaltier. All you can do is pray that I miscalculated." Knowing that defeat was at hand, Shaltier continued her frenzied string of attacks. Though her features were distorted, her looks were not diminished. In the face of that, Ains made his final gambit. Despite what he had told Shaltier, his plan had not gone as smoothly as he had intended. To begin with, super tier magic was like a skill, and did not consume MP. However, it was still a form of magic, and he could not access it when transformed into a warrior. Once he dispelled the warrior transformation magic, he would not be able to equip his armor and shield, and they would fall off him. That would make it very difficult for him to resist Shaltier's attacks. If she decided to use a skill of some sort, he might not be able to secure a victory through HP damage with super tier magic. That would spell defeat for him. However, he had no other way to win. Ains briefly went over the timing of his actions. First, he would dispel the warrior transformation, and then he would use a cash item. He smiled. He had never been this profligate in the use of cash items before, even when PvPing in YGGDRASIL. This was the difference between a game and reality, between entertainment and survival. Now, he blocked Shaltier's full tilt attack with his friend's shield, and then he glared at her. He dispelled the warrior transformation, and cast the super tier spell. The same magic circle appeared around him as before, and he prepared to break the hourglass-like cash item. And then he suddenly hesitated. This was because a wave of guilt flooded through him. Guilt at murdering an NPC which his friend had painstakingly created. His hesitation was a fatal mistake. Shaltier did not miss that opening. She noticed the item in Ains's hand and thrust her Spewit Lance, enhanced with a skill. Her plan was to destroy Ains's hand. Having dispelled his warrior transformation, Ains could not possibly avoid Shaltier's attack. And then she felt something. Just as the Spewit Lance was about to destroy the item, she felt something on her spine. That was clearly hostility. Someone hostile had appeared beside Shaltier, so obviously that she could not ignore it. Shaltier averted her eyes from Ains to see who that enemy was. And then she found that there was nobody there. Ains's spell had created a 200-meter wide expanse of desert. WooshOurWorldAudio.com. Nobody else was there besides Shaltier and Ains. The hostility she had felt just now was nowhere to be found, as though she had been daydreaming. Not good, Shaltier exclaimed as she came to her senses, but by then it was already too late. The hourglass shattered, reducing the casting time of the spell to 0. Fallen down. With those words, a brilliant flash erupted between them and swallowed up everything. Shaltier could feel her body disintegrating in the incredible heat. Her carbonized right arm crumbled to dust, while the Spewit Lance slowly fell to what was probably the ground in this bleached white world. Her face was shriveled up from the incoming heat, and all she could see before her was whiteness. Her throat was dried up too. In fact, she did not know if her throat had also been incinerated, so it was difficult to speak. Still, there was one thing she had to say. Shaltier Bloodvathlin marshaled the last reserves of her vitality to give praise. Ah, long live Ains Ulgaun Sama. Truly, you are the mightiest of Nazarik's supreme beings. This was her sincere respect for the Almighty One who had gathered the 41 supreme beings. The heat wave seemed to burn away her bindings, and though her body could not move, she felt unimaginably free. Someone who should not have been there appeared in Shaltier's vanishing consciousness. That someone was the person that had allowed this victory to take place. The undead could ignore just about any form of mind-affecting effect. However, there were certain abilities that produced similar effects, but which were not counted as mind-affecting. That person had used such an ability. Shaltier smiled, and said, "Shorty." Thus satisfied, Shaltier vanished into a world of white. Aura dispelled her skill, Sky Eye, and her puckered pink lips returned to their original shape. There was a look of annoyance on her face as she began scolding someone who was not there. "You dummy. How could you let yourself get mind-controlled, even though you were undead? That's just so stupid of you." What's wrong, Wani-chan? Nothing. Mare looked where Aura had been looking, but since he was deep in the forest, all he could see in any direction was trees. Still, he could tell what Aura was looking at from the way she was facing. She should have been observing the battle between Shaltir and her master. His big sister Aura could use a ranger skill to expand her field of vision to about 2 kilometers. This was why he and his sister were standing watch over the surroundings with the help of the eyeball corpses. Then, has the battle been decided? Ain't Sama won, hands down. That's what I thought too. The form of Ain't Sama, a being that not even the strongest guardian could defeat, appeared in Mare's mind. It was a sensible conclusion. How could the one who led the supreme beings be defeated? Then, Wani-chan, should we go collect Shaltir's equipment? Aura considered what she had seen before terminating her skill. Ain't Sama should have recovered it all. We'll fall back as instructed. Mare knew his sister was in a bad mood, so he said nothing else, but obediently acknowledged her commands. Aura's best friend had been mind-controlled, and made to point her lance at the beloved master to whom they had all sworn their loyalty. While her execution was the expected outcome of such a course of action, she still felt upset about it.